In this video, we're mainly going to talk about a bit of context and linking that to Hitchcock as an auteur. Okay, this is mainly for Vertigo and a sort of comparison to Alien. Less comparison this time, a little bit more focus on Vertigo, but we will still make those incidental comparisons throughout. Again, this is for EDUQAS Film Studies, the comparative question that is related to auteur theory. So in terms of our context then, I'm mainly going to focus on the collapse of the studio system today. And then how that relates to Vertigo, and therefore how that spurred on Hitchcock and the changing, the changing nature of film going into the 50s. So the big five, so you've got MGM, 20th Century Fox, Paramount, Warner Brothers, and RKO. And then you've got the little three, which is Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. All of these had dominance since the beginning of the Hollywood system. They monopolized the cinema system by buying cinemas. They would show their films in cinemas. They would loan other actors out and gain money from loaning those actors out on contract and so on. But they began really exploiting cinema goers and like fixing minimum pricing and so on. It meant that cinema was not really very free and it wasn't accessible for sort of independent filmmakers or smaller filmmakers. And so in 48, the Paramount Decree was passed, and meant all studios were forced to sell their cinemas. Some held on for quite a while. I think MGM held on to their cinemas until something like 1958, where they were forced to sell the rest of them. But they had to sign a binding decree preventing them from fixing cinema prices and allowing more environments to be allowed in the industry rather than just the studio environment. So around the same time, you had the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they were investigating Hollywood over their alleged ties to communism. Most of these were completely unfounded, or any un-American activities, whatever that means. It also resulted in the blacklisting of individuals, and a few directors then fled the United States. They ended up going elsewhere because of the crackdown. So this was an environment where a lot of things were changing in Hollywood, and the environment to create films was changing dramatically. And it was created in response to the beginning of the Cold War. So the biggest threat to the world order was Soviet Russia, according to America, and the spread of communism. And they didn't want that infiltrating all aspects of their society. So what are the results of that? With the collapse of the studio system and sort of like the witch hunt that went on with the HUAC, directors started to gain far more control over their films. Rather than having to rely on a studio to really balance them out, they were able to forge their own destiny in a way. And they were able to compete, independent directors were able to compete on a higher level. It means that then auteur, the idea of auteurism really started to push forward. I'm not saying that this is where it all started, but it definitely was helped by the collapse of the studio system with directors taking control. And this is where you started having the star directors. Not that they weren't there before, but people like Hitchcock really pioneered that idea of a star director. And this obviously like links to Alien because it leads into the 1960s with the emergence of the new wave and sort of the counterculture of film, where we start having independent studios making more money than those big productions. And I always use the example of Cleopatra as like a massive flop, and then you have a few years later other films coming out on a much lower budget that produce far more results. And so how does it relate to Hitchcock and Vertigo then? Hitchcock's freedom to work as an auteur was as a result of these elements coming together. I'm not saying that all of these came together and then Hitchcock became famous. He was already a very well-known director, but he gained far more freedom with the collapse of the studio system in order to exercise his vision and sort of have that complete creative control. And he's considered a creative force that really brought together the cinematography, mise-en-scene, and so on in a film and made it his own. If we're going to talk about any one person being very auteur, it would be Hitchcock, okay? And then I got my class to watch a little bit of the Battleship Potemkin. Now, Potemkin is a Soviet-era film, and the use of expressionism within the film, there are several parallels between that and what Hitchcock was trying to pioneer. And as we talked about before, that is because of his German film training background, where he learned German expressionism. And so when we're thinking of auteur, we also think about common themes that come throughout their work. So like an auteur pattern, if you will. So there's three films I've commented on here. So you've got Psycho, which covers taboo subjects. You've got Rear Window, which covers voyeurism. And then later on Vertigo, which covers voyeurism. And then Shadow of a Doubt, which covers guilt. So All of these elements link to an auteur pattern of having similar themes and similar ideas across all of your work. You don't always have to have that as an auteur, but it's definitely one of those elements that will allow you to pinpoint whether or not somebody is an auteur. But also Hitchcock, as I said, was a star director. He stamped his name on things. And I've got here an advertisement for Psycho because he banned people from going into the cinema late to watch Psycho due to the twist happening in Psycho within the first, I'd say it's around half an hour to 45 minutes of the film. I can't remember the exact timestamp, but obviously the twist happens in Psycho very early, so he didn't want anyone coming in and spoiling it for themselves. He wanted them to be able to watch it from the beginning. But Hitchcock knew of his star fame. He knew of his sort of auteurism, even if it wasn't necessarily called that by himself. But he used it for marketing. It became marketability. And the same way you've got people like Tarantino. People say, I'm going to go watch the new Tarantino because it is a star director. This is the origins of those ideas of star directors. And also, he cameos in his own films. You can see this one here from Vertigo, where he's literally just walking across the street. There's the famous Alfred Hitchcock silhouette that is often artistically done these days in a much more minimalist pattern. You've got Hitchcock here in Psycho as he's walking out of Bates Motel, or not Bates Motel, just a hotel, if I remember. And then you've got down here in The Birds. So there's the infamous cameo and the silhouettes of Hitchcock. And then, so those are the main elements I wanted to talk about today when it comes to context. These are some good elements of context that you could draw upon. And one other element that would be really useful here, if I just move on, is what I've talked about before, which is the German influence on Hitchcock. He trained in UFA in Berlin, where he was able to draw upon the German expressionist style. And then also, I've got two quotes here from Hitchcock. The German years were the most important, and sound should go off and the audience still know what's going on. I showed elements of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which I would recommend anyone watch. It's a brilliant German expressionist film. But there are several elements in here which could be compared to Hitchcock's work, and you can see how that influence comes about. So I hope that's been really useful, and thank you very much for listening.